was being forged in conflict. Yingyang became king of the state of Qin at the age of 13, in 246 BCE, following the death of his father. For the first several years of his reign, he was merely a figurehead while regents and advisors wielded actual power. But as he matured, Yingyang began to assert his authority. By his early 20s, he had removed those who sought to control him and had taken direct command of Qin's military and political apparatus. What followed was one of the most remarkable military campaigns in ancient history. The state of Qin, located in what is now Shaanxi province, had several advantages. Its position in the Wei River Valley gave it rich agricultural land and natural defenses. Previous Qin rulers had implemented legalist reforms that created an efficient, centralized administration and a powerful military machine. Soldiers were rewarded based on merit and the number of enemy soldiers they killed, creating a ferociously motivated army. The state had also benefited from the construction of the Dujiangyan irrigation system, which controlled flooding and provided water for agriculture, ensuring food security that could support large military campaigns. Yingyang used these advantages brilliantly. Beginning in 230 BCE, he launched a series of military campaigns against the other 6 major states. The state of Han fell first in 230 BCE, followed by Zhao in 228 BCE, Wei in 225 BCE, Chu in 223 BCE, Yang in 222 BCE, and finally Qi in 221 BCE. Within the span of just 9 years, Yingyang had accomplished what no ruler before him had achieved. He had conquered all the warring states and unified China under a single government for the first time in centuries. To mark this achievement, Yingyang took a new title. He called himself Qin Shi Huang, which translates as First Emperor of Qin or First Sovereign Emperor. The title Huang had previously been reserved for mythical sage kings and divine rulers. By adopting it, Yingyang was making a bold claim about his own status and authority. He was not merely a king ruling over one state among many. He was the emperor of a unified realm, a figure whose authority was absolute and whose reign would, he hoped, last for 10,000 generations. The first emperor immediately set about transforming his new empire. He standardized weights and measures, ensuring that commerce could flow smoothly across formerly hostile territories. He standardized the written script, making it possible for officials throughout the empire to communicate clearly despite speaking different dialects. He standardized the width of cart axles, so that vehicles could use the same roads and ruts throughout the realm. He ordered the construction of a massive network of roads and canals to facilitate travel and trade. He began building what would eventually become the Great Wall of China, connecting and extending earlier defensive walls built by various states to protect the northern frontier from nomadic invasions. But the first emperor was also a harsh and authoritarian ruler. He ordered the burning of books that he deemed subversive or useless, particularly philosophical texts from schools of thought that questioned legalist doctrines. Scholars who protested were reportedly executed. He forced hundreds of thousands of laborious to work on his building projects under brutal conditions, with many dying in the process. His reign was marked by both extraordinary accomplishment and tremendous suffering. And through it all, Qin Shi Huang was obsessed with death, or more precisely, with avoiding it. Ancient texts record his desperate search for immortality. He sent expeditions to search for magical islands where immortals supposedly lived and where an elixir of eternal life could be found. He consulted with alchemists and took various substances that were supposed to grant longevity, substances that may have included mercury and other toxic materials that likely hastened his death rather than preventing it. He was paranoid about assassination, constantly changing where he slept and trusting few people. But even as he searched for ways to live forever, Qin Shi Huang prepared for the possibility of death. He began construction of his tomb shortly after becoming king at age 13, and the project continued throughout his reign, eventually involving more than 700,000 laborious according to historical accounts. The tomb was not simply a burial chamber. It was a recreation of his empire in miniature, an underground realm where the emperor could continue his reign even in death. Ancient texts describe the tomb's interior as containing palaces and towers, with rivers of mercury flowing through it, representing the rivers and seas of China. The ceiling was reportedly decorated with pearls and gems representing celestial bodies. Crossbows were supposedly installed to automatically shoot any intruders who dared enter. Whether all these descriptions are accurate remains unknown, because the central tomb mound has never been excavated. It sits as a large hill in the landscape, covered in vegetation, with archaeologists hesitant to disturb it both out of respect and concern about preservation, given that any treasures inside would likely deteriorate rapidly once exposed to air. But what we do know, thanks to the farmers who dug that well in 1974, is that surrounding this central tomb chamber are vast pits containing the Terracotta Army. These warriors were not discovered in ancient texts. No historical record specifically mentioned their existence. They were a complete surprise, a hidden legacy that Qin Shi Huang left for the future, though whether he intended them to be found or expected them to remain buried forever is something we can only speculate about. The emperor died in 210 BCE while on a tour of eastern China. He was 50 years old. His death was kept secret for some time as his advisors plotted to control the succession. Eventually, his younger, more pliable son was installed as the second emperor, but the Qin dynasty would not last long. Within 4 years of the first emperor's death, rebellion had broken out across the empire. The harsh legalist policies, the heavy taxation, the forced labor, the executions, all of these created deep resentment. By 206 BCE, just 15 years after unification, the Qin dynasty had fallen, replaced by the Han dynasty which would rule China for the next 4 centuries. But beneath the earth near the ancient capital of Xianyang, now modern Lebanon, the first emperor's clay army remained, standing guard in the darkness, unknown and undisturbed for more than 2,000 years. The warriors waited in their pits, arranged in formation, ready for battles that would never come, protecting an emperor whose body lay in a tomb that no living person had entered since the day it was sealed. And each warrior bore a unique face, a distinct expression, features that marked them as individuals rather than merely as generic soldiers. These faces would wait in darkness until that day in 1974 when farmers searching for water would bring them back into the light. When archaeologists first began excavating the site systematically, they quickly realized they were dealing with something of unprecedented scale and complexity. The area that would become known as Pit 1 measures approximately 230 meters long and 62 meters wide, covering an area of over 14,000 square meters. It contains an estimated 6,000 terracotta warriors arranged in military formation, though not all have been excavated, and many that have been are in fragmentary condition, broken by the collapse of the wooden roof that once covered the pit and by fires that swept through the complex at some point in antiquity, possibly during the rebellions that followed the first emperor's death. The warriors in Pit 1 are arranged facing east, in battle formation. The front rows consist of 3 lines of infantry, totaling about 210 warriors, who serve as the vanguard. These soldiers are more lightly armored than those behind them, positioned as the front line that would engage the enemy first. Behind them stand the main body of the army, arranged in 11 corridors running north to south, separated by rammed earth walls. Each corridor contains 4 columns of warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, creating a dense formation that would have been typical of Qin military tactics. On the northern and southern flanks, as well as at the rear, stand warriors facing outward, serving as flank guards to protect the formation from attacks from the sides or rear. What becomes immediately apparent when observing these warriors, even in photographs, is the extraordinary level of detail in their construction. These are not crude clay figures. Each warrior stands approximately 1.8 meters tall, roughly life-sized or perhaps slightly taller than the average height of men in ancient China. They stand in various poses, some with arms extended as if holding weapons, others in more relaxed stances. Their armor is rendered in meticulous detail, with individual plates, ties, and rivets clearly visible. Their clothing shows wrinkles and folds. Their shoes show treads and laces. But it is the faces that truly capture attention. As archaeologists cleaned and studied warrior after warrior, the astonishing truth became undeniable. Each face was different. Not subtly different, not varied in a few standardized ways, but truly individually different in the way that real human faces differ from one another. Some warriors have round faces, others have long, narrow faces. Some have broad noses with wide nostrils, others have narrow, refined noses. Some have wide-set eyes, others have eyes that are closer together. Some have prominent cheekbones, others have softer facial structures. Some appear young, barely old enough to be soldiers, while others have weathered faces suggesting years of military service. Some have expressions that appear stern and intense, others seem calm and thoughtful, still others carry a hint of what might be interpreted as weariness or even sadness. The discovery of this individuality raised immediate questions. Why would the creators of this army go to such extraordinary lengths to make each face unique? In an era long before photography, before even realistic portraiture was common in Chinese art, why would someone commission what amounts to 8,000 individual portrait sculptures? The labor involved would have been staggering. The time required would have been immense. The artistic skill needed would have required numerous talented craftsmen working simultaneously. Some scholars have theorized that the faces might represent actual soldiers from the Qin army, that the terracotta figures might be portraits of real men who served the first emperor. This would explain the diversity and individuality of the features. It would also align with the emperor's apparent desire to take his entire realm with him into the afterlife, including his military forces. If the warriors were indeed modeled on real soldiers, it would represent an unprecedented effort to capture and preserve the faces of ordinary individuals, not just kings and nobles but common soldiers, in a time when such representations were extraordinarily rare. Other scholars suggest that while the faces are unique, they may not be portraits of specific individuals but rather the result of craftsmen deliberately varying features to create a sense of a real army composed of diverse individuals. This interpretation sees the uniqueness as an artistic and cultural choice, a statement about the value of individual human beings even within the collective structure of an army. The Terracotta Army would then represent an artistic philosophy that valued individuality alongside conformity, diversity alongside unity. Archaeological evidence suggests that the warriors were created using a combination of standardized and individualized production methods. The bodies were constructed using molds, with legs, torsos, and arms created separately and then assembled. This allowed for efficient production of the basic forms. But the heads, and particularly the faces, show evidence of individual hand sculpting. After a basic head form was created, possibly also from molds providing a few different basic shapes, craftsmen would hand sculpt individual features, adding noses, ears, eyes, mouths, beards, mustaches, and other details that made each face unique. This combination of mass production for bodies and individual craftsmanship for faces allowed the project to proceed relatively quickly while still achieving the remarkable individuality that makes the Terracotta Army so extraordinary. It suggests a workforce that was highly organized, with some craftsmen specializing in body production while others, presumably more skilled, focused on creating the faces. The process would have required coordination on a massive scale, with clay preparation, molding, assembly, carving, firing, painting, and finally placement in the pits, all proceeding simultaneously across multiple workshops. The kilns needed to fire these warriors would have been substantial, capable of reaching temperatures of around 1000 degrees Celsius to properly fire the clay. Archaeologists have found evidence of kill sites near the tomb complex, suggesting that the warriors were manufactured nearby and then transported to the pits where they would stand. Each figure would have taken days or weeks to complete from start to finish, meaning that the entire project likely took decades, perhaps the entire duration of the first emperor's reign after he began the tomb construction at age 13 until his death at age 50. But why this particular form of burial accompaniment? Why terracotta soldiers rather than something else? The answer lies in ancient Chinese beliefs about death and the afterlife, beliefs that evolved over centuries and reached their most elaborate expression during the Qin dynasty. In earlier periods of Chinese history, it was common practice for rulers to be buried with actual human sacrifices, with servants, soldiers, concubines, and others killed to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. This practice, while horrific from a modern perspective, reflected a belief that the deceased would need attendance and protection in the realm of the dead just as they had in life. By the time of the Qin dynasty, this practice had largely been replaced with symbolic substitutes. Earlier tombs featured small figurines representing servants and soldiers, made of wood or simple clay. But Qin Shi Huang, in keeping with his ambition in all things, took this practice to an unprecedented scale. Rather than small figurines, he commissioned a life-sized army. Rather than simple representations, he demanded individuality and realistic detail. His Terracotta Army was not just a symbolic gesture but an attempt to recreate an actual military force that could protect him and serve him in the afterlife. The scale of ambition reflected in the Terracotta Army tells us much about Qin Shi Huang's personality and reign. This was a ruler who thought in grand terms, who mobilized the resources of an entire empire to realize his visions, who demanded perfection and was willing to expend whatever labor and resources were necessary to achieve it. The same mentality that unified China, that built thousands of kilometers of roads and walls, that standardized systems across a vast territory, also created this underground army where every single face was individually crafted. Pit 1, despite its enormous size and the thousands of warriors it contains, is only the beginning of the story. As excavations continued, archaeologists discovered additional pits, each revealing more about the scale and complexity of the tomb complex. Pit 2, discovered in 1976, lies about 20 meters north of Pit 1. It is smaller, covering about 6,000 square meters, but it contains a more diverse array of figures. Rather than just infantry, Pit 2 contains cavalry units with terracotta horses, archers in kneeling and standing positions, and war chariots. The arrangement in Pit 2 is more complex, with 4 distinct military units that could operate independently or coordinate their movements, reflecting sophisticated military tactics of the period. The warriors in Pit 2 show the same remarkable individuality in their faces as those in Pit 1. The archers, captured in the moment of drawing their bows, have expressions of concentration and focus. The cavalry soldiers, standing beside their terracotta horses, often have slightly different facial features and expressions from the infantry. Some scholars have noted that the cavalry figures sometimes appear younger or have features suggesting they might represent soldiers from different ethnic groups, possibly reflecting the reality that cavalry units in ancient Chinese armies often included soldiers from nomadic peoples of the northern steppes who were expert horsemen. Pit 3, discovered in 1976, is much smaller, containing only about 68 warriors plus a war chariot and horses. But its significance lies not in numbers but in what it represents. The warriors in Pit 3 appear to be high-ranking officers, suggested by their more elaborate armor and the layout of the pit, which resembles a command headquarters. This pit may represent the command structure of the army, the generals and officers who would direct the movements of the larger forces in Pits 1 and 2. The faces of these officers show distinct characteristics, often appearing older and more weathered than the common soldiers, with facial features suggesting authority and experience. A fourth pit was discovered, designated Pit 4, but it was found to be empty. Whether it was never filled, or whether its contents were removed in antiquity, remains unknown. The empty pit stands as a reminder that much about the tomb complex remains mysterious, that not all questions can be answered even with careful archaeological investigation. Beyond the warrior pits, excavations have revealed other areas of the tomb complex containing different types of terracotta figures. One area contained life-size terracotta officials dressed in elaborate robes, representing the civil bureaucracy rather than the military. Another area contained figures of acrobats and performers, perhaps representing the entertainments that the emperor enjoyed. Yet another area contained bronze birds, including cranes and waterfowl, arranged around what appears to be a recreation of a garden or park. Most remarkably, excavators discovered pits containing real chariots made of bronze, crafted at half life size with extraordinary detail, complete with horses that show individual features in their own right. All of these discoveries paint a picture of a tomb complex that was meant to be a complete world, with not just military forces but also civil administration, entertainment, nature, and all the elements of the emperor's realm recreated in miniature or full scale for the afterlife. And throughout this underground world, the principle of individuality in representation appears repeatedly. Even the bronze horses show individual features and expressions. The civil officials have unique faces. The entertainers each have distinct appearances. This commitment to individuality across such a vast project is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire tomb complex. It would have been far easier and faster to create standardized figures, to repeat the same few face types across thousands of warriors. But someone, presumably the first emperor himself, decided that each figure should be unique, that the faces should be as diverse as the faces of real soldiers in a real army. This decision transformed what might have been merely an impressive archaeological site into something profound, a statement about human diversity and individuality captured in clay. Now we must turn our attention more directly to those faces themselves, to examine how the craftsman created such remarkable diversity, and to explore what the faces reveal about ancient Chinese understanding of human features and human nature. The first thing to understand about the terracotta faces is the level of anatomical accuracy they display. These are not stylized or simplified representations. The craftsmen who created them understood human facial anatomy with remarkable precision. Each face shows proper proportions, with eyes, nose, mouth, and ears positioned correctly relative to one another. The bone structure beneath the surface is evident, with cheekbones, brow ridges, and jaw lines clearly defined. The faces show understanding of how muscle and flesh sit on the underlying skull, creating the contours and shapes that make human faces recognizable as such. But beyond basic anatomy, the faces show awareness of the subtle variations that make each human face unique. Human facial diversity arises from small differences in dozens of features. The distance between the eyes, the width of the nose, the thickness of the lips, the prominence of the cheekbones, the shape of the jaw, the height of the forehead, the size and shape of the ears, all of these and many other factors combine to create the infinite variety of human faces. The terracotta craftsmen understood this and used it deliberately to create their individual warriors. Consider the eyes. In many ancient art traditions, eyes were represented in highly stylized ways, often as simple almond shapes or circles. But the terracotta warriors show eyes with anatomical precision. The eyeballs sit realistically in their sockets. The upper and lower eyelids show proper thickness and curvature. Some warriors have eyes that are more rounded, others have eyes that are narrower and more elongated. Some have upper eyelids that show a pronounced fold, others have less visible folds. The shape of the eye opening varies significantly from warrior to warrior, with some appearing more open and alert, others more hooded or slightly narrowed. The eyebrows, too, show remarkable variation. Some warriors have thick, bushy eyebrows that dominate the upper face. Others have thinner, more refined eyebrows. The angle of the eyebrows differs, with some appearing more horizontal, others more sharply angled upward toward the temples. Some eyebrows are straight, others curved. These variations in eyebrow shape and position contribute significantly to the overall expression of each face, making some warriors appear stern or fierce, others calm or thoughtful. The noses show perhaps even more diversity than the eyes. Human noses vary enormously in shape and size, and the terracotta warriors reflect this diversity fully. Some warriors have broad noses with wide nostrils and prominent bridges. Others have narrow, refined noses with smaller nostrils and subtle bridges. The tip of the nose varies from bulbous to pointed. The angle at which the nose projects from the face differs. Some noses are straight, others have a slight curve or hook. The nostrils themselves vary in size and shape, some round, others more triangular or slit-like. This diversity in nose shapes has led some scholars to suggest that the warriors may represent soldiers from different ethnic groups within the Qin Empire. China has always been ethnically diverse, with various groups occupying different regions. The Qin state itself was located in a region where multiple ethnic groups interacted. As the first emperor conquered other states, his army would have incorporated soldiers from across the territories he controlled. The variety of facial features in the terracotta warriors may reflect this ethnic diversity, capturing not just individual variation but also the broader diversity of the human populations that made up the empire. The mouths and lips show similar careful attention to variation. Some warriors have full, prominent lips, others have thinner lips. The width of the mouth varies considerably. Some mouths are set in what appears to be a neutral expression, lips gently closed. Others appear slightly pursed, as if the warrior is concentrating or perhaps suppressing emotion. A few warriors have mouths that curve slightly upward at the corners, suggesting a hint of a smile or at least a more pleasant disposition. Others have mouths that turn slightly downward, creating a more serious or even dour expression. The craftsman also paid attention to the chin and jaw line, areas that contribute significantly to the overall structure and character of a face. Some warriors have strong, prominent chins that project forward. Others have more receding chins. The jaw line varies from square and strong to more rounded and soft. These variations affect not just the appearance but also the impression the face creates, with stronger jaw lines suggesting strength and determination, while softer jaw lines create a gentler overall impression. The ears, though perhaps less immediately noticeable than eyes or noses, also show individual variation. Human ears differ in size, shape, and the way they attach to the head. Some people have ears that lie close to the head, others have ears that protrude more noticeably. The terracotta warriors reflect these variations, with some having larger, more prominent ears and others having smaller, more delicate ears that sit closer to the head. But perhaps most remarkably, the faces show variations in overall structure and proportion that create distinct face shapes. Some warriors have round faces with full cheeks and soft contours. Others have long, narrow faces with angular features. Some have square faces with broad foreheads and strong jaw lines. Others have more triangular faces, wider at the forehead and narrowing toward the chin. These overall face shapes, combined with the specific features, create the sense that we are looking at portraits of real individuals rather than generic representations. The wrinkles and lines on the faces add another layer of individuality and realism. Some warriors have smooth faces suggesting youth, with no visible wrinkles or age lines. Others have lines around the eyes, crow's feet that suggest years of squinting in the sun or smiling. Some have furrows between the eyebrows, vertical lines that suggest concentration or perhaps habitual frowning. Others have horizontal lines across the forehead. A few warriors have laugh lines around the mouth or nasolabial folds running from nose to chin that become more pronounced with age. These age markers allow us to estimate that the warriors represent soldiers of different ages, from young men perhaps in their late teens or early 20s, fresh recruits with smooth faces and no hint of weathering, to older veterans in their 30s, 40s, or even older, with faces marked by years of service. This age diversity makes sense if the army is meant to represent a real military force, which would naturally include soldiers at various stages of their careers. The expressions captured on the faces are subtle but present. Unlike modern sculpture, which often captures strong emotions, the terracotta warriors generally show more neutral or restrained expressions. This reflects both the cultural context, where overt emotional display was often considered inappropriate especially in military settings, and the practical consideration that soldiers standing in formation would typically maintain a disciplined demeanor. However, within this restraint, the craftsman managed to suggest individual personality and character. Some warriors have faces that appear intense and focused, with slightly narrowed eyes and firm-set mouths suggesting concentration and readiness for combat. Others appear calmer and more relaxed, with softer features and more open expressions suggesting confidence and composure. A few appear thoughtful or introspective, with subtle asymmetries in the face or slight angles of the head that suggest they might be thinking about something beyond the immediate moment. Still others appear more stern or harsh, with harder features and more rigid expressions suggesting strict discipline or perhaps a naturally severe personality. These subtle variations in expression, combined with the physical variations in features, create warriors that seem to have individual personalities. It's important to note that we cannot know whether these personalities were intentional, whether the craftsmen were trying to capture specific character traits, or whether the variations in expression are simply the result of different craftsmen working with different styles and techniques. But the effect remains: each face seems to tell a story, to suggest an individual human being with their own thoughts, feelings, and experiences. The question of how the craftsmen achieved this individuality has been studied extensively by archaeologists and art historians. Close examination of the warriors reveals the techniques used. The basic head shape was likely created using molds, with perhaps a dozen different basic head forms available. This would provide the foundation and allow for relatively quick production of the basic structure. But after the mold head was removed from the mold and while the clay was still workable, craftsmen would hand sculpt the individual features. The production process itself represents a remarkable organizational achievement. Archaeological evidence from the site suggests that multiple workshops operated simultaneously, each contributing different components to the final warriors. Some workshops specialized in producing legs, using standardized molds that created relatively uniform lower bodies. Other workshops focused on torsos, creating the chest and back sections that would later be attached to the legs. Arms were produced separately, with different positions available depending on whether the warrior would hold a weapon, grasp reins, or stand at rest. The assembly of these components required careful planning and execution. Each piece had to be created with consideration for how it would connect to the others. The clay had to be at the right consistency for joining, neither too wet nor too dry. The joins had to be strong enough to survive handling, firing, and the weight of the assembled figure. Evidence shows that craftsmen scored or roughened the surfaces to be joined and used liquid clay slip as an adhesive, techniques that are still used in ceramic work today. But it was in the creation of the heads that the most sophisticated work occurred. Evidence of hand sculpting is visible in the way features are added and refined. The nose appears to have been built up by adding clay to the basic head form and then shaping it. The craftsman would roll clay into appropriate shapes, apply it to the face, and then smooth and blend it until it appeared to be part of the original form rather than an addition. The size and shape of the added clay determined the final appearance of the nose, allowing for infinite variation from the same basic starting point. The ears were similarly added as separate pieces and then blended into the head. Human ears are complex structures with multiple curves, folds, and projections. Creating realistic ears in clay requires understanding of this anatomy and the skill to translate it into sculptural form. The terracotta warriors' ears show this understanding, with properly formed helices, lobes, and inner structures. The ears are positioned correctly on the head, angled appropriately, and sized in proportion to the face, all details that require knowledge and care to execute properly. The eyes were created by first forming the eye socket, then adding the eyelids and refining their shape with tools and fingers. Creating realistic eyes in sculpture is notoriously challenging. The eye is not simply a flat surface but a complex three-dimensional structure with the eyeball sitting in a socket, covered by lids that have thickness and curvature. The upper and lower lids must meet properly at the corners of the eye. The shape of the eye opening must look natural and must be positioned correctly relative to the nose and other features. The terracotta craftsman mastered these challenges, creating eyes that look anatomically correct and that show individual variation. Some warriors have more deeply set eyes, with prominent brow ridges creating shadow over the eye socket. Others have eyes that are more forward and open. Some have thicker eyelids, others thinner. The corners of the eyes angle differently on different warriors, with some having eyes that tilt upward at the outer corners and others having more horizontal eye lines. All these variations affect the overall expression and appearance of the face. The mouth was cut and shaped into the face, with lips built up or carved to create proper form. The human mouth is capable of countless subtle variations in shape and position, and these variations communicate much about a person's mood, personality, and age. The terracotta craftsman captured this subtlety, creating mouths that differ significantly from warrior to warrior while all looking natural and realistic. The philtrum, the vertical groove running from the nose to the upper lip, is visible on many warriors, showing attention to anatomical detail. The corners of the mouth, where upper and lower lips meet, are carefully formed and positioned, creating the foundation for the warrior's expression. The fine details, like the wrinkles and age lines, were incised into the clay using pointed tools. These tools left characteristic marks that are still visible under close examination. Some wrinkles were created by pressing a tool into the clay to create a depression. Others were made by dragging a tool across the surface to create a line. The depth and character of these marks vary, creating wrinkles that look natural rather than mechanical. Forehead wrinkles, which typically run horizontally across the brow, were created with careful attention to how real wrinkles form. In actual human faces, forehead wrinkles often appear as series of curved lines that are deeper in the center of the forehead and fade toward the temples. The terracotta craftsman replicated this pattern, creating wrinkles that look like they were formed by actual facial movement and habitual expressions rather than simply decorative lines. Crow's feet, the wrinkles that radiate from the outer corners of the eyes, are another detail that the craftsman captured with realism. These wrinkles form from years of squinting and smiling, and their presence and depth give clues about a person's age and disposition. Warriors with pronounced crow's feet appear older and more weathered, while those with smooth eye areas appear younger. The craftsman understood that these details contributed to the overall impression of the individual and included them despite the additional time and skill required. Nasolabial folds, the lines that run from the sides of the nose down toward the corners of the mouth, deepen with age and are prominent on many of the older-looking warriors. These folds are created by the underlying facial muscles and bone structure, and rendering them correctly requires understanding of facial anatomy. The terracotta versions show proper positioning and natural curvature, adding to the realistic appearance of the faces. The toolbox available to the ancient craftsmen was simpler than modern sculpting tools but was apparently sufficient for their purposes. Knives or sharp blades were used for cutting and trimming. Wooden or bamboo implements served for smoothing and shaping. Pointed tools created fine details and incised lines. The craftsmen's hands themselves were probably their most important tools, used for pressing, shaping, and smoothing the clay. The sensitivity of human touch allowed them to feel the clay's consistency and responsiveness, adjusting their technique moment by moment as they worked. The clay itself was carefully selected and prepared. Not all clay is suitable for large ceramic work. The clay must have proper plasticity, allowing it to be shaped and hold detail. It must have sufficient strength when dry to support its own weight during handling and firing. It must fire properly without excessive shrinkage, cracking, or warping. The clay used for the warriors appears to have been sourced locally and then refined through a process of mixing, wedging, and aging that removed air bubbles and created a uniform consistency. The addition of temper materials, small particles of sand or crushed ceramic mixed into the clay, helped control shrinkage and prevent cracking during drying and firing. The proportion of temper had to be carefully controlled, enough to provide structural benefits but not so much that the clay became too coarse to hold fine detail. Analysis of the terracotta shows that the craftsmen understood this balance and maintained consistent clay bodies across the thousands of warriors. The firing process itself was critical to the success of the project. The kilns had to be large enough to accommodate life-sized figures, hot enough to fully vitrify the clay, and controllable enough to prevent damage from temperature fluctuations. Firing clay is as much art as science, requiring experience and judgment to manage the complex interactions of heat, clay chemistry, and kiln atmosphere. The fact that the vast majority of warriors survived their original firing intact demonstrates the skill of the kiln operators. The firing would have taken days for each batch of warriors. The kiln had to be heated gradually to allow moisture in the clay to evaporate without causing explosive steam formation. Then the temperature had to be raised to the firing temperature and held there for hours to ensure complete vitrification throughout the thick clay bodies. Finally, the kiln had to be cooled gradually to prevent thermal shock that could crack the warriors. This entire process for each firing cycle might have taken a week or more, meaning that the kilns operated continuously for years to produce the entire army. Loading and unloading the kilns required care and planning. The warriors had to be positioned so that heat could circulate around them but so they wouldn't fall or touch each other during firing, which could cause damage. Kiln furniture, ceramic supports and separators would have been used to create proper spacing. The craftsmen had to calculate how much the clay would shrink during firing and account for this in their initial sizing and positioning. Evidence of firing supports remains visible on some warriors, showing where they rested during their time in the kiln. Quality control throughout this process would have been essential. With thousands of warriors being produced, some system had to exist to ensure that standards were maintained, that each warrior met minimum requirements for quality and appearance. This might have involved inspections at various stages, with supervisors checking work and rejecting pieces that didn't meet standards. The relatively high quality visible across the discovered warriors suggests that such quality control was effective, though the variation in execution also suggests that some tolerance for individual craftsman's style was acceptable. This hand sculpting meant that even if two heads started from the same basic mold, by the time the craftsman finished adding and refining features, they would look completely different. It's similar to how identical twins, despite having the same genetic starting point, develop subtle differences in appearance based on their individual experiences and environmental factors. The terracotta faces, starting from similar molds, became unique through the individual work of different craftsmen or the same craftsman working at different times with slightly different approaches. The workshop organization required for this massive project represents an extraordinary achievement in human coordination and management. Historical records suggest that more than 700,000 labours worked on the Emperor's Tomb complex, though this figure likely includes workers on all aspects of the project, not just the terracotta warriors. Even if only a fraction of this workforce focused on creating the warriors, we are still talking about thousands of people engaged in various tasks from clay preparation to finished warrior placement. Division of labor would have been essential for efficiency. Some workers would have specialized in quarrying and transporting the clay from source locations to the workshops. Others would have processed the clay, removing impurities, adding temper, and creating the uniform consistency needed for quality ceramic work. Still others would have operated the molds that created basic body forms. Specialist sculptors would have added and refined the individual facial features. Painters would have applied the pigments after firing. Assembly crews would have put together the component pieces. Transportation teams would have moved finished warriors to the pits. Installation workers would have positioned the warriors in their final formations. Each of these specializations required specific skills and training. A clay processor needed to understand clay properties and how different treatments affected workability and firing behavior. A sculptor needed manual dexterity, artistic vision, and anatomical knowledge. A painter needed understanding of pigment chemistry and application techniques. The organization and coordination of all these specialists working simultaneously toward a common goal required management structures and communication systems that were sophisticated for any era, let alone ancient times. The timeline for the project adds another layer of complexity. If work began when the future emperor was 13 years old and continued until his death at 50, that represents roughly 37 years of sustained effort. But the production of the warriors likely didn't begin immediately, as the tomb complex would have started with excavation and structural work before the creation of burial goods. Even if we assume 25 or 30 years of active warrior production, creating 8,000 or more unique figures in this timeframe required producing roughly one warrior every day or two on average, and likely more during peak production periods. This production rate seems impossible until we remember that multiple workshops operated simultaneously. If 10 workshops each produced one warrior every 2 weeks, the entire army could be created in about 30 years. If 20 workshops operated, the timeline shortens proportionally. The archaeological evidence of multiple workshop areas near the tomb site supports the theory of simultaneous production at multiple locations. Quality while maintaining this production pace required skilled craftsmen rather than simply abundant labor. Rushing through warrior creation would have resulted in crude, poorly executed figures. The high quality visible in the warriors suggests that craftsmen were given sufficient time to do good work, that the emphasis was on quality rather than simply quantity. This reflects well on the project management, indicating that those overseeing the work understood that the emperor deserved the best possible craftsmanship rather than hasty production that merely met numerical quotas. The training of craftsmen for this project must have been substantial. While some might have come to the work already skilled in ceramic arts, others would have needed training in the specific techniques required for warrior production. This training would have taken time, with apprentices learning under master craftsmen before being trusted with independent work. The presence of some warriors that show less skillful execution alongside more masterful examples suggests that indeed craftsmen of varying skill levels worked on the project, perhaps with less experienced workers handling simpler tasks while masters focused on the most challenging aspects like facial sculpting. The social structure of the workshop community is fascinating to consider. Hundreds or thousands of craftsmen working together for years would have formed a distinct community with its own hierarchy, customs, and culture. Master craftsmen would have held high status, their skills valued and rewarded. Apprentices would have competed for recognition and advancement. Friendships and rivalries would have developed. Knowledge would have been shared, with techniques spreading through the community as workers observed and learned from each other. Living conditions for these workers remained somewhat mysterious. Were they housed near the workshops in dormitories or camps? Did they live in nearby villages and commute to work sites? Were they free craftsmen employed for wages, or conscripted laborers forced into service? Historical records suggest that tomb construction generally involved a mix of skilled artisans who were paid and conscripted laborers who worked under compulsion, but the specific arrangements for the terracotta warrior production are not clearly documented. The psychological experience of the craftsman is worth considering as well. What was it like to spend years creating clay soldiers for a tomb you would never see completed, for an emperor who might never even see your work? Did the craftsmen take pride in their creations, or did they view it as merely exhausting labor? When sculpting individual faces, did they think about the lives of soldiers they knew, or was it purely an artistic exercise? Did they leave any messages or signatures in their work, hidden details that might identify specific craftsmen centuries later? Some researchers have searched for such signatures, looking for patterns or distinctive features that might identify individual craftsmen's work. Certain stylistic tendencies do appear to recur, suggesting that some warriors might have been created by the same sculptor. One craftsman might favor slightly broader noses, while another might consistently create more pronounced cheekbones. However, definitively attributing specific warriors to specific craftsmen remains challenging, as the hand-finishing work means that even if basic forms came from the same molds, the final appearance varies significantly. The tools and techniques used by the craftsmen represent accumulated knowledge from centuries of Chinese ceramic tradition. Pottery in China dates back thousands of years before the Qin dynasty, with each generation of potters adding to the collective knowledge base. By the time the terracotta warriors were being created, Chinese craftsmen had mastered high-fire ceramics, complex glazes, large-scale production, and sophisticated decorative techniques. The warriors represent the application of this accumulated expertise to an unprecedented challenge, creating life-sized human figures with detailed individuality rather than the vessels, tiles, and small figurines that were more typical ceramic products. The choice of terracotta as the medium is itself significant. Bronze was available and was used for other elements of the tomb complex, including the famous bronze chariots discovered near the mausoleum. Stone was used for architectural elements. Wood was used for various purposes. But terracotta was chosen for the warriors themselves. This choice likely reflected practical considerations. Terracotta was more affordable than bronze for such large-scale production, easier to work in fine detail than stone, and more durable than wood. But it also reflected cultural associations, as terracotta had long been used in Chinese burial contexts for mingqi, objects created specifically for tombs. The durability of terracotta has proven fortunate for modern archaeology. While wood has largely decayed and bronze can corrode, the fired clay of the warriors has survived remarkably intact where it was protected from physical damage. The faces, with their fine details, remain legible more than 2,000 years after their creation. This longevity was perhaps not accidental. The creators may have understood that terracotta would endure, that their work would survive far into the future, even if they never imagined that future archaeologists would excavate and study the warriors with such intensity. The relationship between the terracotta warriors and earlier Chinese artistic traditions shows both continuity and innovation. Small pottery tomb figurines had been common in China for centuries before the Qin dynasty. These earlier mingqi typically depicted servants, animals, and sometimes soldiers, but they were much smaller than life-size and less detailed. The terracotta warriors represent a scaling up of this tradition, taking the concept of tomb figurines and executing it at a monumentally larger scale with dramatically increased realism and individuality. This innovation reflects the personality and ambitions of the first emperor himself. Qin Shi Huang was not content with following tradition when tradition seemed inadequate to his vision. He transformed Chinese government, law, writing, and infrastructure. He approached his tomb in the same spirit, taking existing practices and reimagining them on a scale and with an ambition that exceeded anything attempted before. The terracotta warriors embody this approach, respecting tradition by including tomb figurines but transforming the tradition by creating an entire army in full scale with unprecedented realism. The first emperor's character, as revealed through historical records and through the tomb complex itself, shows someone who was simultaneously visionary and tyrannical, creative and cruel, brilliant and paranoid. He unified China and created systems that would influence Chinese civilization for centuries, but he did so through violence, forced labor, and suppression of dissent. The terracotta warriors, magnificent as artistic and technical achievements, were created through the conscription of labor and the diversion of resources that might have been used to improve the lives of ordinary people. This duality, achievement built on suffering, is common in history. Many of humanity's most impressive monuments were created by coerced labor under authoritarian regimes. The moral complexity this creates does not diminish the achievement of the craftsmen who executed the work or the value of studying and preserving what they created. Rather, it reminds us that history is complicated, that great art can emerge from unjust circumstances, that we can appreciate craftsmanship while also acknowledging the human cost of the projects that employed it. The faces of the warriors, looking at us across the centuries, embody this complexity. They are beautiful, skillfully executed, worthy of admiration and study. They are also products of a system that valued imperial glory over individual well-being, that marshaled human and material resources for the glorification of a single ruler. When we look into those terracotta faces, we can appreciate the artistry while also remembering the context of their creation, the unnamed craftsmen who shaped them, the workers who labored to build the kilns and workshops, the soldiers who may have served as models, all caught up in the vast machinery of empire. The clay itself contributes to the sense of life in these faces. Fired terracotta has a warmth to it, a subtle texture that resembles skin more than stone does. In ancient times, when the warriors were originally painted, this resemblance would have been even stronger. But even now, after more than 2 millennia, after the paint has faded and the warriors stand in their terracotta color, the material itself seems appropriate for human representation, warm and earthy rather than cold and distant. The texture of the clay surface, visible under close examination, shows the marks of the craftsman's tools and fingers. These marks were not erased or polished away but remain as evidence of the human hands that shaped each face. In some areas, fingerprints are still visible, pressed into the clay more than 22 centuries ago and preserved through firing. These fingerprints create an intimate connection across time, a physical trace of the individual craftsman who cannot otherwise be identified. Running your eyes across a terracotta face, you can almost follow the craftsman's process. Here is where they smoothed the cheek with their palm. There is where they used a tool to define the edge of the eyelid. This line was created with a quick, confident stroke. That wrinkle was incised more carefully, with multiple passes to achieve the right depth. The texture tells a story of hands working clay, of artistic decisions being made, of skill being applied to create something that would endure. The slight imperfections add to rather than detract from the realism. Real human faces are not perfectly symmetrical or smoothly finished. They have irregularities, asymmetries, textures, and variations that make them recognizably organic rather than mechanical. The terracotta faces, with their subtle imperfections preserved in clay, achieve this organic quality. They look handmade in the best sense, crafted with care by skilled humans rather than produced by machines or created through purely mechanical repetition. The weathering that the warriors have experienced over 2 millennia has, in some cases, enhanced rather than diminished their expressive power. The softening of some edges, the accumulation of soil deposits in crevices, the subtle variations in surface color, all contribute to a sense of age and authenticity that newly created replicas, no matter how accurately sculpted, cannot match. These warriors have truly been buried for centuries, and they carry that history in their surfaces. Different warriors show different levels of preservation, depending on where they were positioned in the pits and what they experienced during and after the collapse of the wooden roof structures. Some warriors were crushed by falling beams and had to be extensively reconstructed from fragments. Others emerged relatively intact, needing only minor stabilization and cleaning. The variations in condition add another layer of individuality to the warriors, with each carrying its own unique history of burial and discovery. The reconstructed warriors, reassembled from hundreds of fragments, represent extraordinary achievements in archaeological conservation. Matching fragment to fragment, determining which pieces belong to which warrior, assembling them in correct positions, all of this requires patience, skill, and deep understanding of ceramic structure and warrior construction. The conservators who performed this work became intimately familiar with the warriors, spending months or years with individual figures, learning every surface and edge, developing an almost personal relationship with these ancient objects. Some warriors remain incomplete, with missing sections that could not be recovered or identified among the thousands of fragments excavated from the pits. These incomplete figures have their own poignant quality, fragmentary witnesses to the past, like ancient manuscripts with missing pages or ruins of once complete buildings. They remind us that much has been lost, that what survives is only a portion of what once existed, that absence is as much a part of the archaeological record as presence. The contrast between complete and fragmentary warriors creates visual and emotional interest when viewing the excavation sites. The complete warriors demonstrate what was achieved, the full vision of the craftsman, and the remarkable preservation of some areas. The fragments demonstrate the vulnerability of cultural heritage, the reality of deterioration and damage, the work required to study and preserve the past. Together, they tell a more complete story than either could alone. Archaeological excavation techniques have evolved significantly since the first discoveries in 1974. Early excavations proceeded relatively quickly, driven by excitement and curiosity, but sometimes at the cost of information preservation. More recent work proceeds much more slowly and carefully, with extensive documentation at every stage, with preservation measures implemented immediately, with scientific analysis integrated into the excavation process rather than conducted only after objects are removed. Photography now documents every stage of excavation, creating visual records that can be consulted long after the excavation is complete. Three-dimensional scanning creates digital models that preserve spatial relationships and exact dimensions. Soil samples are collected and analyzed to understand the burial environment. Microbiological surveys identify organisms that might threaten preservation. Every fragment is photographed, measured, and catalogued before being moved. This meticulous approach means that excavation proceeds at a pace that would have seemed impossibly slow to earlier archaeologists, but the quality and quantity of information preserved makes the careful pace worthwhile. The site itself has become a complex management challenge, balancing research needs, conservation requirements, tourist access, and educational programming. The decision to build museum structures directly over some pits allows visitors to view the warriors in situ, seeing them approximately where they stood for centuries. This creates powerful impressions of scale and context that would be lost if warriors were only displayed in traditional museum settings. The sight of hundreds of warriors standing in formation in the vast halls creates impact that individual warriors in glass cases cannot match. However, these museum buildings also create conservation challenges. The presence of thousands of visitors daily changes the environment of the pits, increasing humidity from breath and perspiration, raising carbon dioxide levels, potentially introducing microorganisms, creating vibrations from footsteps. Managing these impacts requires constant monitoring and intervention, with climate control systems, air filtration, and visitor flow management all playing roles in preservation strategy. The question of whether to excavate more of the tomb complex or leave it for future archaeologists with better preservation technology remains actively debated. Arguments for continued excavation emphasize the knowledge that could be gained, the stories that could be told, the increased understanding of ancient Chinese civilization that would result. Arguments for restraint emphasize preservation concerns, noting that everything excavated immediately begins to deteriorate and that future technology will likely allow better preservation than current methods achieve. This debate reflects broader tensions in archaeology and heritage management. How do we balance the desire to learn against the responsibility to preserve? How do we honor past cultures by studying their remains while also respecting those remains by not unnecessarily disturbing them? How do we serve current generations' interest in the past while also preserving heritage for future generations? These questions have no easy answers, and different scholars and stakeholders reach different conclusions based on their values and priorities. The first emperor's main tomb mound remains unexcavated, sitting as a large hill covered in vegetation. Ancient texts describe its interior as containing palaces, towers, rivers of mercury, and various treasures and mechanisms. Whether these descriptions are accurate, exaggerated, or purely legendary remains unknown. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive survey methods have detected anomalies within the mound that might be chambers or structures, but definitive information about the tomb's interior awaits excavation that may never occur, or may not occur for decades or centuries. The decision to leave the main tomb unexcavated frustrates some people who would like to see its secrets revealed, but demonstrates wisdom and restraint on the part of Chinese archaeologists and heritage managers. They recognize that what is buried is preserved, that excavation equals exposure equals deterioration, that patience serves preservation. The terracotta warriors, discovered and excavated, provide ample material for study and appreciation. The main tomb can wait, protected by earth and time, until such moment as excavation can be conducted with minimal risk to whatever it contains. The terracotta warriors demonstrate that major discoveries can transform understanding even without excavating every possible site. Before 1974, no one knew this army existed. Ancient texts did not describe it. Legends did not preserve its memory. It was completely forgotten, yet it survived in the earth, waiting. This reminds us that what we know about the past is always incomplete, that discoveries yet to be made might revolutionize our understanding, that humility about our knowledge is always appropriate. What other wonders might remain buried, forgotten, waiting for accidental discovery or systematic survey to reveal them? The terracotta warriors were found by farmers digging a well, not by archaeologists conducting a planned excavation. How many other sites of comparable importance might exist, unknown and unprotected, vulnerable to destruction through development or looting before they can be properly studied? These questions drive archaeological survey work and heritage protection efforts worldwide. The international impact of the terracotta warrior discovery extended beyond academic archaeology. The warriors captured public imagination in ways that few archaeological discoveries do. Their human-like appearance, their extraordinary preservation, their sheer numbers, and the dramatic story of their discovery and purpose combined to create a phenomenon that transcended specialist interest and became part of global popular culture. Exhibitions of terracotta warriors that tour internationally draw enormous crowds wherever they appear. Millions of people who will never visit Lebanon have seen individual warriors on display in museums in their own countries. These exhibitions serve multiple purposes, generating revenue that supports conservation and research, building cultural bridges between China and other nations, and educating global audiences about ancient Chinese civilization. The warriors become ambassadors, representing not just the Qin dynasty but Chinese cultural achievement more broadly. The faces of the warriors play a central role in their public appeal. People connect with faces, recognizing in them a common humanity that transcends time and culture. When visitors to exhibitions stand before a terracotta warrior and look into its face, they often report feeling a sense of connection, as if they are looking at a real person rather than an artwork. This emotional response drives interest and engagement in ways that more abstract or non-figurative artifacts cannot match. The educational value of the warriors extends across disciplines. History students learn about ancient China, the Qin dynasty, and Emperor Qin Shi Huang's role in Chinese unification. Art students study sculptural technique, compositional principles, and the relationship between form and function. Technology students examine ceramic engineering, materials science, and manufacturing processes. Philosophy students contemplate questions about art, culture, power, and mortality raised by the tomb complex. The warriors serve as entry points into multiple fields of knowledge, making them valuable teaching resources. Children particularly respond to the warriors, perhaps because the life-sized figures and individual faces make ancient history feel more real and accessible than text descriptions or small artifacts might. Educational programs designed around the warriors often emphasize hands-on activities like clay modeling, allowing children to experiment with techniques similar to those the ancient craftsmen used. These activities create embodied understanding that complements intellectual learning, making the past tangible and memorable. The warriors have inspired artists worldwide, who create works that reference, reinterpret, or respond to them. Contemporary sculptures that echo the warriors' poses or replicate their style appear in various contexts. Paintings and photographs incorporate warrior imagery. Performance artists stage events involving the warriors or warrior-like figures. These artistic responses demonstrate how the warriors continue to generate creativity and meaning, how ancient art inspires contemporary art, how cultural heritage remains vital and relevant rather than merely historical. What's also striking is what the craftsmen chose not to standardize. In many ancient armies and in later periods of Chinese history, there was often an emphasis on uniformity, on soldiers looking identical, representing a collective force rather than a group of individuals. The Terracotta Army could have followed this principle, making all the soldiers look similar or identical to emphasize their role as parts of a unified military machine. Instead, the opposite choice was made, to emphasize that this army was composed of individual human beings, each different from the others, each bringing their own unique presence to the collective whole. This choice reflects something profound about the cultural and philosophical context of the Qin period. Despite the legalist ideology that emphasized collective organization and strict hierarchy, there was apparently also room for recognizing and valuing individual human uniqueness. The Terracotta Army suggests that the ancient Chinese, or at least the creators of this army, understood that an effective military force was not a faceless mass but a collection of individual soldiers, each with their own face, their own personality, their own contribution to make. As we examine these faces more closely, as we look into the clay eyes and study the carved features, we find ourselves engaging in a strange form of time travel. These faces were created more than 22 centuries ago by craftsmen whose names we don't know, possibly representing soldiers whose names are also lost to history. Yet the faces remain, looking out at us across the vast gulf of time. And because each face is unique, because each one shows individual human features, we can almost feel as if we're looking at actual people from the past, not just representations or symbols but windows into the lives of individuals who lived and walked the earth when Rome was still a republic and Greece was producing its classical philosophy. The faces invite us to wonder about the men they might represent. Who were they? Where did they come from? What were their lives like? Did they really serve in the Qin army, or are these faces purely the inventions of artists? If they were real soldiers, what battles did they fight? What did they think about as they stood in formation or marched along the roads the empire was building? Did they believe in the first emperor's vision of a unified China, or did they resent being conscripted into his service? Did they fear death, or welcome the honor of being represented in clay to serve their emperor for eternity? We cannot answer these questions with certainty, but the faces make us ask them, and in asking, we connect across time to the human experience of military service, of individual identity within collective organization, of life and death and the hope for something beyond death. The Terracotta Army, through its faces, makes ancient history personal rather than abstract, human rather than merely historical. Beyond the basic facial features, another aspect of the terracotta warriors contributes significantly to their individuality and tells us much about the culture that created them. The hairstyles, beards, and mustaches of the warriors show remarkable variety and careful attention to detail, adding another layer of uniqueness to each figure and providing valuable information about ancient Chinese military culture and social practices. Hair has always been culturally significant in human societies, and ancient China was no exception. The way a person wore their hair could indicate their age, social status, occupation, ethnicity, and even their philosophical or religious beliefs. In the context of a military force, hairstyles could indicate rank, unit affiliation, or regional origin. The terracotta warriors reflect this cultural significance through the diverse hairstyles represented across the army. The most common hairstyle among the warriors involves hair pulled back and tied into a bun or top knot on the back or top of the head. This practical style would have kept hair out of a soldier's face during combat while also conforming to ancient Chinese aesthetic preferences. However, the specific details of how these buns are arranged vary significantly from warrior to warrior. Some have buns positioned high on the crown of the head, creating a distinctive silhouette. Others have buns positioned lower on the back of the head. Some buns are tight and compact, others are larger and looser. The way the hair is pulled back also varies. Some warriors show hair that is smoothly drawn back from the forehead and temples, while others show more texture and variation in how the hair lies against the scalp. Some warriors have what appears to be a part line in their hair, while others have hair that is pulled straight back without a part. These variations, while subtle, contribute to the individual appearance of each warrior and suggest attention to realistic detail in how different types of hair behave when styled. Some warriors wear caps or headgear that partially or fully covers their hair. The style of these caps varies, with some being simple cloth caps that fit close to the head, while others are more elaborate pieces that suggest higher rank or specialized function. The caps themselves are rendered with careful attention to how fabric drapes and folds, adding texture and visual interest to the head and upper body of the warrior. Warriors wearing caps still show individual faces beneath, with the headgear serving as an additional element of their distinct appearance rather than making them more uniform. Among the warriors, facial hair is common but not universal, and where it appears, it shows the same diversity and attention to detail as the other features. Some warriors have full beards that cover the lower face and chin. These beards are not simply generic additions but are sculpted with attention to the flow and texture of hair. Some beards are thick and bushy, suggesting vigorous growth and perhaps less frequent trimming. Others are neater and more closely cropped, suggesting more careful grooming. The style of beards varies as well. Some warriors have beards that follow the line of the jaw and chin, framing the lower face symmetrically. Others have beards that are fuller in some areas than others, creating a less uniform appearance that seems more realistic, as real beards often grow more thickly in some areas than others. A few warriors have beards that come to a point beneath the chin, a style that might indicate particular care in grooming or perhaps a cultural preference. Mustaches appear on many warriors, either alone or in combination with beards. The mustache shows significant variety in style and size. Some are thin lines of hair above the upper lip, neat and precisely defined. Others are fuller and bushier, extending beyond the corners of the mouth. Some mustaches droop downward at the ends, creating a distinctive appearance sometimes associated with older or more experienced soldiers. Others curve upward slightly or remain horizontal. The presence or absence of facial hair, and the style when present, may indicate various things about the individual warrior. In ancient Chinese culture, facial hair was often associated with maturity and masculinity. Older men typically had more facial hair than younger men, so warriors with full beards might represent older, more experienced soldiers, while those with smooth faces might represent younger recruits. Facial hair styles might also indicate regional or ethnic origin, as different groups within China had different traditions regarding facial hair grooming. The level of detail in the hair and facial hair is remarkable when you consider that these features required additional work beyond the basic face sculpting. Each strand or section of beard had to be individually carved or incised into the clay. The texture of hair had to be suggested through careful tool work. This attention to detail extends even to areas of the warrior that might not be immediately visible, such as the hair at the nape of the neck or the underside of the chin, suggesting that the craftsmen were committed to creating complete, realistic representations rather than just focusing on the most visible aspects. Some warriors show what appears to be stubble or very short facial hair, represented by subtle texture in the clay rather than defined beard or mustache shapes. This suggests even finer gradations in the representation of facial hair, capturing warriors at different stages of grooming or with different growth patterns. The ability to represent such subtle variations in terracotta demonstrates the high level of skill possessed by the craftsman. The combination of hairstyle and facial hair with the other facial features creates compound uniqueness. A warrior with a particular face shape and nose type might look completely different from another warrior with similar facial structure but different hair and beard styling. This multiplication of variables means that even if some basic face molds were repeated, which they apparently were, the final products still appear highly individual due to all the additional variations layered on top of the basic forms. Cultural and symbolic meanings likely attached to some of these variations. In ancient China, certain hairstyles were associated with different regions or ethnic groups. The queue or long braid, for example, was associated with some northern nomadic peoples, though it became more common in later Chinese history. Top knots of various styles had different meanings in different periods and regions. By showing variety in hairstyles, the Terracotta Army might be representing the ethnic and regional diversity of the Qin Empire, showing that the emperor's army drew from multiple populations across his realm. Rank and role within the military also appears to be indicated by hairstyle and headgear. Officers and higher-ranking warriors, identifiable by other features like more elaborate armor, often also have more elaborate hairstyles or distinctive headgear. Some wear headpieces that resemble birds or other animals, likely indicating command positions or elite status. The generals found in Pit 3, the command headquarters pit, have particularly elaborate hairstyles and headgear that set them apart from common soldiers. The attention given to hair and facial hair also tells us something about ancient Chinese artistic traditions and priorities. Hair is notoriously difficult to represent in sculpture. It has a unique texture that differs from skin or fabric, and capturing the flow and movement of hair while working in a relatively inflexible medium like fired clay requires significant skill. The fact that the terracotta craftsman took on this challenge and executed it so successfully across thousands of warriors demonstrates both their technical ability and the importance placed on realistic, detailed representation. One particularly interesting aspect of the hair representation is how it suggests motion and life despite being frozen in clay. Hair that is pulled back into buns or secured under caps looks like it would move if disturbed, like real hair rather than solid clay. Some strands of hair are shown escaping from buns or from under caps, creating a sense of natural disorder that makes the warriors seem less like perfect, idealized statues and more like actual soldiers who have been standing in formation, whose hair has been affected by wind or movement, who are real rather than merely symbolic. The technical challenge of creating these varied hairstyles and facial hair across thousands of warriors should not be underestimated. Each element had to be hand-carved and shaped while the clay was still workable but firm enough to hold detail. The craftsman had to work quickly enough that the clay didn't dry and crack, but carefully enough to achieve the fine detail visible in the finished products. They had to understand how clay behaves during firing, how it shrinks slightly and how fine details can be lost if not properly executed. They had to ensure that added elements like ears and beard details were properly bonded to the base head form so they wouldn't fall off during firing or over time. The success of these craftsmen in meeting these technical challenges across thousands of individual warriors points to a well-organized workshop system with skilled masters and trained assistants. It suggests quality control mechanisms that ensured each warrior met certain standards of execution even while allowing for individual variation. It speaks to a level of craft organization and expertise that rivals or exceeds anything else known from the ancient world. Some researchers have used computer analysis to study the hairstyles and other features of the warriors, looking for patterns and categories within the apparent diversity. These studies have identified a limited number of basic hairstyle types, perhaps 8 to 10 distinct styles that appear repeatedly across the warriors. However, within each basic type, there are numerous small variations in execution that create individuality. Two warriors might have the same basic top-knot style, but the exact position, size, and detailing of their buns differ enough that they still appear as distinct individuals. This combination of limited basic types with infinite small variations is actually characteristic of human diversity in general. Most humans share similar overall features and configurations, yet the small variations in proportion, positioning, and detail create unlimited uniqueness. The terracotta craftsmen, whether consciously or instinctively, captured this principle in their work, using a manageable number of basic templates but varying them sufficiently to create the appearance of true individuality. The cultural meaning of hair in ancient China extended beyond mere appearance. Hair was considered precious, a gift from one's parents that should be respected and maintained. Cutting or damaging one's hair could be seen as disrespectful to one's ancestors. This belief meant that hairstyling, rather than hair cutting, was the primary way of managing and displaying one's hair. The elaborate buns and arrangements seen on the terracotta warriors reflect this cultural attitude, showing hair that has been arranged and controlled but not cut short in the manner that might be more practical for military purposes in some other cultures. Military regulations in various Chinese dynasties specified how soldiers should wear their hair, recognizing that proper hair arrangement was part of military discipline and order. The Terracotta Army, in showing soldiers with properly arranged hair, depicts an army that follows regulations and maintains discipline. Yet within this framework of regulation and discipline, individual variation still appears, suggesting that conformity and individuality could coexist, that soldiers could maintain proper military appearance while still retaining personal distinctiveness. The beards and mustache also carry cultural weight. In ancient China, as in many cultures, facial hair was associated with wisdom, maturity, and authority. Important officials and philosophers were often depicted with full beards. Warriors with facial hair might be showing their status as experienced soldiers worthy of respect. The variety of beard styles might indicate different levels of experience or different cultural backgrounds, as grooming practices varied across the empire. Some warriors appear to have carefully trimmed and shaped facial hair, suggesting personal vanity or concern with appearance even within military life. This humanizes the warriors, reminding us that soldiers are not just fighting machines but individuals who care about how they look, who maintain personal grooming standards even in challenging circumstances. The presence of such detail in the terracotta representation suggests that the craftsmen and those who commissioned them valued this humanization, wanted to show soldiers as complete human beings rather than merely as military components. The absence of facial hair on some warriors is as significant as its presence on others. Young soldiers, represented with smooth faces, create a generational diversity within the army. This would reflect military reality, where armies throughout history have drawn on both young recruits and experienced veterans. The smooth-faced warriors might represent young men serving their first campaigns, perhaps conscripts fulfilling mandatory military service, while the bearded warriors represent career soldiers who have served for years. Looking at the warriors with attention to their hair and facial features together creates a powerful impression of seeing real people. The combination of a particular face shape, a specific nose and eye type, a particular hairstyle, and a specific beard style creates a unique signature that makes each warrior memorable as an individual. Visitors to the excavation sites often report feeling that they are looking at actual soldiers frozen in time rather than at artwork, and this impression stems largely from the accumulated detail of individualized features, including the careful attention to hair. The preservation of these details over more than 2,000 years is itself remarkable. Clay is durable, but fine details can be worn away by water, root growth, or simple handling. Many warriors were damaged when the wooden roofs of the pits collapsed, breaking the figures into pieces that archaeologists have painstakingly reassembled. Yet even on reassembled warriors, the fine details of facial hair and hairstyle often remain clear and legible, testament to the quality of the original craftsmanship and the protective environment of the sealed pits where the warriors stood for centuries. Now we turn our attention to the higher-ranking figures within the Terracotta Army, the officers and generals who commanded the troops and who show their own distinctive features and characteristics that set them apart from the common soldiers we have been examining. These figures provide insight into ancient Chinese military hierarchy and leadership while continuing to demonstrate the remarkable individuality that characterizes the entire Terracotta Army. Identifying officers and generals among the terracotta warriors is possible through several visual markers beyond just facial features. These higher-ranking figures wear different armor than common soldiers, usually more elaborate and with more layers of protection. They wear distinctive headgear, often caps with elaborate decorative elements or even crown-like pieces that indicate command authority. They stand in different positions within the formations, typically toward the rear or sides where commanders would position themselves to observe and direct troop movements. But even more than these external markers, the faces of the officer and general figures show distinct characteristics that set them apart. Many of these higher-ranking figures appear older than the average soldier, with more pronounced wrinkles and age lines. Their faces often show more weathering, suggesting years of military campaigns and outdoor service. The expressions tend toward greater severity and authority, with firmly set mouths and intense gazes that suggest leadership qualities and command presence. One of the most famous examples is a figure known as the General, discovered in Pit 1. This figure stands notably taller than surrounding soldiers, reaching about 1.96 meters in height. He wears elaborate armor with a fish scale pattern, highly detailed and covering more of his body than the armor worn by common soldiers. His hands are positioned as if they once held a weapon, likely a sword or ceremonial baton that indicated his command authority. But it is his face that truly marks him as a leader. The general's face is square and strong, with a broad jaw and prominent cheekbones. His eyes are deeply set under heavy brows, giving him an intense, penetrating gaze. His nose is large and prominent, the kind of feature that might be described as distinguished or commanding. His mouth is wide and firmly set, the lips neither full nor thin, creating an expression of determination and authority. He has a substantial mustache that extends beyond the corners of his mouth, and a full beard that covers his chin and jaw, both sculpted with careful attention to the flow and texture of the hair. What's particularly striking about the general's face is how it combines authority with individuality. This is not a generic representation of leadership but a specific individual's face that happens to convey leadership qualities. The asymmetries and unique features that make every terracotta face individual are present here as well. His left eye appears slightly different from his right eye, a subtle asymmetry that makes the face more realistic. The lines on his face are not perfectly symmetrical either, suggesting a real person's face shaped by years of habitual expressions rather than an idealized construct. Other officer figures show similar combinations of authority and individuality. One middle-ranking officer, distinguishable by his armor and position, has a face that is long and narrow, quite different from the general's square structure. His features are more refined, with a smaller, more pointed nose and thinner lips. Yet his expression is equally commanding, with a slight downward turn to the mouth that suggests strictness or severity. His beard is less full than the general's, more neatly trimmed, perhaps suggesting a more fastidious personality or simply a different grooming standard. Another officer figure has a rounder face, almost jovial in its proportions, with full cheeks and a broader nose. Yet his eyebrows are sharply angled and his eyes are narrow and focused, creating an expression that belies the potentially friendly impression of his face shape. This officer has no beard, just a thin mustache, making him appear younger than the general but still clearly a figure of authority based on his armor and position. These variations among the officers demonstrate that leadership faces are as diverse as the faces of common soldiers. There is no single template for what a commander should look like. Instead, individuals of various facial types and features could rise to leadership positions, presumably based on merit and ability rather than conformity to a physical ideal. This diversity among leaders is actually more realistic than many artistic representations from various cultures, which often depicted leaders as conforming to idealized physical types. The officers' faces also show more evidence of personality and character than many of the soldier faces. Perhaps because these were fewer in number, or because they represented more important individuals, the craftsmen spent more time on them, creating more nuanced expressions and more detailed features. Or perhaps higher-ranking individuals had more say in how they were represented, ensuring that their distinctive features were accurately captured. Some scholars have speculated that the officer and general figures might be actual portraits of real commanders in the Qin army, while the common soldiers might be more generic representations. This would make practical sense, as there would have been far fewer high-ranking officers than common soldiers, making it feasible to create individual portraits of actual commanders while using varied but not specifically portraiture-based faces for the mass of troops. However, there is no definitive evidence for this theory, and the high level of individuality among all the warriors suggests that perhaps everyone, regardless of rank, was represented with equal attention to uniqueness. The positioning of officers within the formations is revealing. In Pit 1, officers are positioned at the ends of rows and at strategic points where they could observe and direct their sections of the formation. Their faces are oriented forward like the soldiers, but their slightly elevated positions and distinctive appearance would have made them easily identifiable to the troops under their command. In Pit 3, which appears to be a command headquarters, the figures are all officers and high-ranking officials, creating a concentration of authority figures with particularly distinctive faces and elaborate costumes. One fascinating aspect of the officer figures is how they show different styles of leadership presence. Some have faces that appear stern and uncompromising, the kind of leaders who rule through discipline and perhaps fear. Others have faces that appear more thoughtful or contemplative, suggesting leaders who win respect through wisdom and careful planning. A few have faces that seem almost benevolent, with softer features and less severe expressions, suggesting leaders who inspire loyalty through personal charisma rather than harsh discipline. These different leadership styles represented in the faces align with ancient Chinese military philosophy as expressed in texts like The Art of War, which discusses different types of generals and different approaches to command. Sun Tzu wrote about how different situations require different types of leadership, how flexible and adaptive commanders are more effective than rigid ones. The diversity of officer faces in the Terracotta Army might reflect this philosophical understanding, showing that effective military leadership comes in many forms. The generals and officers also show variation in their facial hair that goes beyond what we see in common soldiers. Some have elaborate beards that are clearly maintained with care, with defined shapes and edges that suggest regular grooming. These might indicate individuals of higher social status for whom personal appearance is particularly important. Others have more natural-looking beards that suggest less vanity but perhaps greater focus on practical military matters. These variations in grooming add another layer of personality to the officer figures. The headgear worn by officers deserves special attention as it interacts with the face to create the overall impression of the figure. Some officers wear caps with flaps that frame the face, drawing attention to the facial features. Others wear more elaborate pieces that sit higher on the head, creating a more imposing silhouette. The way these pieces of headgear are sculpted shows the same attention to detail as the faces themselves, with textures and folds that suggest real fabric and with positioning that looks natural on each individual head rather than generic. One particularly interesting officer figure wears what appears to be a cap with two vertical projections or horns rising from it. This distinctive headgear immediately marks him as special, possibly indicating a specific command position or elite status. His face beneath this remarkable headpiece is lean and angular, with high cheekbones and a sharp jawline. His eyes are narrow and intense. He has a thin beard that follows his jawline and a small mustache. The overall impression is of someone who is sharp in both appearance and intellect, a strategic thinker and careful planner. The social implications of the officer figures and their distinctive faces are significant. In ancient Chinese society, military service was one of the primary paths to social advancement, especially for those not born into the aristocracy. A successful military career could elevate a person's status and ensure their family's prosperity. The fact that officers in the Terracotta Army are shown with individual faces, with personality and character, suggests that these individuals were valued not just for their functional role but as important persons whose specific identity mattered. This contrasts with some historical periods and cultures where military leaders were selected primarily based on aristocratic birth, where family background mattered more than individual ability. While the Qin dynasty certainly had hereditary aristocracy, the military was increasingly meritocratic, with promotion based on achievement in battle. The terracotta officers, with their diverse faces suggesting diverse backgrounds, might reflect this meritocratic principle, showing that leadership could come from various sources and types of people. The preservation of officer figures varies, with some being remarkably intact and others having been damaged and restored. Where restoration has occurred, archaeologists and conservators have been careful to distinguish between original material and restored editions. Some officer figures have been restored multiple times as techniques have improved, with earlier, less accurate restorations being removed and replaced with more faithful reconstructions based on better evidence and understanding. Looking at the officer faces alongside the soldier faces creates a complete picture of a military organization from top to bottom. We see the young recruits with smooth faces and uncertain expressions, the experienced soldiers with weathered features and confident bearing, the junior officers who are beginning to show authority in their faces, and the senior commanders with the gravitas and presence that years of leadership responsibility create. This hierarchical diversity makes the Terracotta Army feel like a real organizational structure rather than just a collection of statues. The officers remind us that the Terracotta Army was not just meant to be numerous but was meant to be functional, to represent an actual working military force that could protect the emperor in the afterlife. Real armies require leadership, organization, and hierarchy. The presence of clearly identifiable officers and generals with their own distinctive features shows that whoever planned this army understood military reality and wanted to recreate it as faithfully as possible in terracotta form. When we stand before these officer figures, whether in person at the excavation site or through photographs and videos, we are confronted with individuals who commanded respect and authority more than 2,000 years ago. Their faces, preserved in clay, still convey that authority. They remind us that leadership is ultimately personal, that it resides in individuals whose character and ability set them apart, regardless of the passage of time. All of the warriors we have been discussing, from common soldiers to high-ranking generals, originally appeared dramatically different from how they look today. When first created and placed in the pits, these figures were not the uniform terracotta color we associate with them now. They were painted in bright, lifelike colors that would have made them appear startlingly realistic. Understanding the original coloration of the warriors adds another crucial dimension to our appreciation of their individuality and the artistry that created them. Archaeological evidence for the original painting comes from several sources. When warriors were first excavated, particularly in more recently opened areas where exposure to air had been minimized, traces of pigment were visible on the terracotta surface. These pigments deteriorated rapidly upon exposure to air and light, sometimes fading within minutes of exposure, but before they disappeared completely, researchers were able to identify and analyze them. Additionally, some pigment remains preserved in protected areas of figures, such as under layers of armor or in deep crevices that were not exposed to air flow. Chemical analysis of these pigments reveals a sophisticated palette. The ancient craftsmen used cinnabar for bright red, malachite for green, azurite for blue, and various iron oxides for different shades of red, brown, and yellow. White pigment came from bone or lead compounds, and black from carbon or organic materials. These were mineral-based pigments that were mixed with binding agents, probably lacquer or egg white, to help them adhere to the fired terracotta surface. The faces of the warriors were painted with colors intended to approximate realistic skin tones. A base layer of pink or peachy color was applied to the face, created by mixing white and red pigments. This provided a flesh-toned foundation. Then details were added on top of this base layer. The lips were painted a darker shade of red or pink, making them stand out from the rest of the face. The eyebrows and any facial hair were painted black or dark brown, providing strong contrasts that would have made these features highly visible and expressive. The eyes were painted with particular care and detail. The whites of the eyes were painted white, naturally enough. The irises were painted black or dark brown, with some warriors possibly having been given brown irises to create variation even in eye color. The pupils were painted black if they weren't already included in the dark iris color. The eyelids sometimes show traces of color, suggesting they might have been outlined or colored to enhance their definition and expressiveness. The result would have been eyes that looked remarkably lifelike, that seemed to actually see, that gave the warriors an animated quality they lack in their current unpainted state. The importance of this painting cannot be overstated. While modern viewers have become accustomed to the terracotta color and might even prefer the sculptural purity of the unpainted clay, the ancient viewers for whom these warriors were created would have seen them as incomplete or lifeless without their paint. Color was integral to the intended effect. The warriors were meant to look as realistic as possible, and realistic humans are colored, not monochrome. The different colors of armor and clothing on the warriors created visual variety that enhanced the sense of looking at a diverse group of individuals. Soldiers were painted wearing armor in various colors, including green, red, purple, and blue. These colors might have indicated different ranks, different units, or might simply have been chosen to create a visually rich and varied array. The clothing visible beneath armor was also painted in different colors, with some warriors wearing red robes, others green, others purple or blue. These color variations would have made the army appear less uniform and more diverse. The fact that not all soldiers were painted identically in terms of their clothing and armor colors is significant. It would have been simpler to paint all soldiers the same colors, creating a uniform appearance that emphasized their collective identity as an army. Instead, the choice was made to use varied colors, which reinforced the individuality that was already present in the sculpted faces and features. Each warrior was unique not just in facial features but also in coloration, making them doubly individual. The technical challenges of painting thousands of warriors should not be underestimated. Each figure needed multiple coats of paint, with base layers applied first and details added later. The paint had to be allowed to dry between coats. The application had to be precise, particularly for facial features where small errors in painting could destroy the carefully sculpted expressions. The painters had to work with mineral pigments that could be difficult to apply evenly and that behaved differently from each other in terms of how they mixed, dried, and adhered. The painting process would have required specialists distinct from those who sculpted the warriors. Sculpture and painting are different skills, and the level of precision visible in the traces of original pigment suggests that trained painters, not just the clay sculptors, worked on the warriors. This implies another layer of organization and specialization in the workshop that produced the army, with different teams handling different aspects of the production process. The loss of the original paint is one of the great tragedies of the excavation. In the excitement of discovery and in the early years of excavation, when preservation techniques were less developed, many warriors were exposed to air without adequate measures to preserve their pigments. The paints, which had survived for over 2,000 years in the sealed, controlled environment of the buried pits, degraded within hours or days of exposure. By the time researchers fully understood what was happening and developed better preservation methods, many warriors had already lost their color permanently. More recent excavations have proceeded more carefully, with efforts to preserve pigment traces whenever possible. Figures are now sometimes treated with preservative chemicals while still in situ, before being fully excavated. When warriors are removed from the pits, they are immediately placed in controlled environments to minimize pigment loss. Advanced photography techniques, including ultraviolet and infrared imaging, are used to detect and document pigment traces that might not be visible to the naked eye. These methods have helped preserve more information about the original appearance of the warriors than was saved in earlier excavations. Based on the surviving pigment evidence, researchers have created reconstructions showing how some warriors probably looked when new. These reconstructions are striking and sometimes surprising to viewers accustomed to the monochrome terracotta appearance. The painted warriors look much more lifelike and present, their painted eyes seeming to focus and engage, their colored clothing making them appear as dressed humans rather than as statues. The pink-toned faces with their painted features look remarkably realistic, close enough to real human faces that the effect can be slightly uncanny. Some of these painted reconstructions have been created as physical replicas, with artisans sculpting new figures matching the original warriors and then painting them based on the pigment evidence. These replicas have been displayed in museums and exhibitions, allowing viewers to see what the Terracotta Army originally looked like. The difference between painted and unpainted versions is dramatic, with the painted versions having an immediacy and liveliness that the unpainted versions lack. The painted faces add emotional resonance to the warriors. When we look at unpainted terracotta faces, we appreciate them as artwork, as skillful sculpture. When we see them painted, they become people. The addition of color crosses some threshold in our perception, triggering recognition of human presence that sculpture alone, however skilled, doesn't fully achieve. This suggests that the ancient craftsmen understood psychology as well as art, knew that color was necessary to create the full effect they sought. The question of exactly how the warriors were meant to be viewed when originally placed in the pits remained somewhat mysterious. The pits were underground, covered with wooden beams and then earth. If the pits were sealed permanently, as they appear to have been, then no one after the initial installation would have seen the painted warriors. They were created for the emperor's afterlife, not for living viewers. This raises interesting questions about artistic effort and audience. The craftsmen created extraordinarily detailed, carefully painted figures that no one except perhaps the workers who placed them and the emperor's spirit would ever see. The effort was made not for public display but for completion of a ritual purpose, for proper service to the emperor in death. This suggests a cultural context where the actual existence of these warriors mattered more than their being seen. They had to be real, complete, and properly executed because their purpose was real and important, not merely decorative or symbolic. The faces had to be individual, the paint had to be applied, the details had to be correct, because these warriors were meant to function as an actual army protecting the emperor. Their artistic quality was in service of their magical or spiritual function, not separate from it. Modern conservation efforts continue to grapple with the challenge of preserving what remains of the original paint while also protecting the terracotta itself. The warriors face threats from environmental exposure, from microorganisms that can degrade both clay and pigment, from salt crystallization that can cause surface erosion, and from simple handling damage. Conservation laboratories work continuously to develop better methods for stabilizing the warriors and preserving them for future study and viewing. Some conservators have experimented with applying new paint to reconstructed warriors, trying to match the original colors and techniques as closely as possible. These experiments help researchers understand the original appearance and also provide insight into ancient painting techniques. How are the pigments mixed? What binding agents work best? How many coats were needed? What tools were used to apply the paint? Experimental archaeology of this kind adds to our understanding of the craftsman's methods and skills. The original brilliance of the painted warriors, now largely lost, reminds us that time changes everything, that the past never survives to the present in its original form. We see the Terracotta Army through the lens of 2 millennia of burial and degradation. What we see is impressive, but it is a shadow of what originally existed. The warriors in their full painted glory must have been breathtaking, an army that looked truly alive, frozen in terracotta but convincingly real in appearance. Imagining the pits as they were when first sealed, filled with thousands of painted warriors standing in formation, their faces individually colored and expressive, their armor bright and varied, creates a vision of extraordinary ambition and achievement. The first emperor, for all his faults and cruelties, commissioned something remarkable, an artwork that attempted to capture the full diversity and individuality of a human army while also creating a magically functional force for the afterlife. The painted faces were the final touch that completed this vision, that transformed clay sculptures into something more. As we study the surviving pigment traces and look at reconstructions, we gain another perspective on the individuality of the warriors. The faces were already unique in their sculpted features, but the painted details added another layer of uniqueness. Two warriors with somewhat similar sculpted features might have been painted differently, one with darker skin tone and one with lighter, one with different colored clothing than the other, creating distinctiveness through color as well as form. The combination meant that truly no two warriors were alike in any respect. This brings us to one of the most intriguing questions surrounding the Terracotta Army and its faces. Are these the portraits of real individuals? Did the craftsmen model their sculptures on actual soldiers who served in the Qin army? Or are the faces creative inventions, imaginary individuals conjured by skilled artists to populate the emperor's afterlife army? The debate over whether the terracotta warriors represent real people has engaged scholars since the army's discovery. There are compelling arguments on both sides of this question, and the truth might lie somewhere in between, with some warriors being portraits and others being artistic creations, or with the warriors being inspired by real people but not exact portraits in the way we think of portraiture today. The argument for the warriors being portraits of real soldiers starts with the extraordinary level of individuality we have been examining. Why go to such lengths to make each face unique unless you were trying to capture specific individuals? Creating thousands of varied but ultimately fictional faces would have been enormously difficult, requiring craftsmen to constantly invent new combinations of features while avoiding repetition. It might have been easier to simply work from life, to bring soldiers in to sit as models while craftsmen sculpted their features in clay. Supporting this theory is the realistic nature of the features. The faces don't look idealized or stylized in the way that purely imaginative artwork often does. They look like real people with all the irregularities and imperfections that real faces have. The asymmetries, the varied proportions, the different ethnic characteristics visible in different warriors, all of these suggest direct observation of real people rather than artistic invention based on abstract principles of what humans look like. Historical context also supports the portrait theory. The first emperor was known for his massive mobilization of labor for his various projects. Hundreds of thousands of people worked on the Great Wall, on his palace complexes, on road construction, and on his tomb. Bringing in soldiers to serve as models for the Terracotta Army would have been entirely consistent with his methods and ambitions. The emperor had access to a large standing army, and selecting representative individuals from that army to be immortalized in clay would have been feasible. Additionally, ancient Chinese culture valued accurate representation in certain contexts. Ancestor portraits were important in Chinese tradition, with families maintaining images of their forebears for worship and remembrance. While these portraits varied in accuracy and often became increasingly stylized over time, the principle that specific individuals should be visually represented and remembered was well established. Extending this principle to the emperor's army would not have been a radical departure from cultural norms. However, there are also strong arguments against the warriors being direct portraits. The sheer number involved is perhaps the most obvious challenge. 8,000 individual portrait sittings would have required enormous time and organizational effort. Even if multiple sculptors worked simultaneously, the process would have taken years. Each sitting would need to be long enough for the sculptor to capture the individual's features accurately, which could take hours or days depending on the level of detail desired. The practical challenges multiply when we consider logistics. Where would these sittings take place? How would soldiers be selected to serve as models? Would they be volunteers, or would specific individuals be chosen for their representative features? How would the sculptors work with their models while simultaneously managing the production demands of creating thousands of warriors? The organizational complexity seems almost overwhelming. Moreover, close analysis of the warriors reveals that they were constructed using modular techniques with basic forms being repeated and then individualized. This suggests a more systematic production process than individual portrait sittings would allow. If each warrior were a true portrait, we would expect more variation in body types, heights, and overall proportions. Instead, the warriors show relatively standardized bodies with the individuality concentrated in the heads and faces. This pattern is more consistent with an assembly line process where bodies are mass-produced and heads are individualized through various techniques. Some researchers have suggested a middle path. Perhaps a group of soldiers, maybe a few dozen or a few hundred, were brought in as models. Their features were carefully observed and captured in clay. Then, these captured features were mixed and matched, combined in various ways to create the thousands of individual warriors. One soldier's eyes might be combined with another's nose and a third's mouth, creating a new individual who resembles the models but is not identical to any single one of them. This combinatorial approach would be consistent with both the evidence of individuality and the practical constraints of production. It would explain why the faces look realistic and drawn from life. They were based on real people, but it would also explain how so many unique faces could be created in the available time and with the required efficiency. The craftsman would have been working from a mental and physical library of features observed from real soldiers, but exercising artistic creativity in how they combined and varied these features. Another theory suggests that the craftsmen may have based some faces on people they knew, soldiers they had seen, or even on themselves and their family members. This would have been a practical approach that didn't require formal portrait sittings but still resulted in faces that looked realistic because they were based on actual people the craftsman had observed and could remember. Each craftsman might have drawn on their own experience and memory to create varied faces, resulting in an army that reflected the diversity of the human population the craftsmen had encountered in their lives. The age variation among the warriors' faces supports the idea of observation from life. The range from young smooth-faced recruits to grizzled veterans with deeply lined faces suggests that the craftsmen understood how faces change with age, knowledge best gained through observation of real people at different life stages. Creating this kind of realistic age diversity purely from imagination would have been challenging, while simply looking at soldiers of different ages and capturing their features would have been straightforward. The ethnic diversity visible in the faces also suggests observation from reality. Some warriors have features that might indicate Central Asian or Northern nomadic ancestry, different from the features more typical of Han Chinese populations. This diversity reflects the historical reality that the Qin army included soldiers from various ethnic groups and conquered territories. Whether specific individuals were being portrayed or whether craftsmen were simply drawing on their observations of ethnic diversity in the military, the result is faces that look authentically varied in ways that match historical reality. One fascinating approach to this question has involved using facial recognition software and statistical analysis to study the warriors. Researchers have photographed hundreds of warriors and analyzed their facial features using computer algorithms designed to detect similarity and difference. These studies have found that while some basic features and proportions appear multiple times, suggesting the use of molds or templates, the specific combinations and detailed features are highly varied. The studies haven't definitively answered whether the faces are portraits, but they have confirmed that the level of individuality is genuine and extensive, not merely an impression created by small variations on a few basic types. Whether the faces are portraits in the strict sense might ultimately be less important than what they achieve artistically and culturally. Even if they are not exact representations of specific individuals, they function as portraits in the sense that they present individual human beings with distinctive features and implied personalities. They make us think of specific people rather than generic humanity. They invite us to imagine the individuals behind the faces, to wonder about their lives and experiences, regardless of whether those specific individuals actually existed. The question of portraiture also relates to broader questions about art and representation. What makes something a portrait? Must it be an exact likeness of a specific person, or can it be a typical or representative individual that captures characteristics of a group while still being rendered as a specific face? The terracotta warriors might be portraits in this broader sense, representations of soldiers that, while not documenting specific historical individuals, still capture something true about the individuals who served in the Qin army. From another perspective, the warriors are portraits of humanity itself, showing the diversity of human faces and forms, the ways that we are all unique while also being fundamentally similar. Each face tells a story, even if that story is not the specific historical biography of a particular person. The story might be more universal, about what it means to be human, to be a soldier, to stand in formation with thousands of others while still retaining individual identity and dignity. When visitors view the warriors, whether in person at Lebanon or through photographs and videos, they often report feeling a connection to the faces they see. People pick out favorite warriors, ones whose faces seem particularly appealing or interesting. They comment on how the warriors seem to have personalities, how you can imagine what they were thinking or feeling. This response suggests that the faces succeed in what might have been their original purpose, to represent real human presence, to populate the emperor's afterlife with what feels like actual people rather than mere symbols or abstractions. The debate about whether these are true portraits will likely continue, perhaps never fully resolved unless new evidence emerges. But in a sense, the question has already been answered by the emotional and imaginative response the faces evoke. They function as portraits regardless of their literal origin, creating a connection between viewers across time and the human individuals, whether real or imagined, that the faces represent. As we examine these faces more closely, with the help of modern technology, we uncover layers of information and meaning that were not visible to early researchers and that continue to reveal new insights about the Terracotta Army and the culture that created it. The application of contemporary archaeological methods and advanced technology to the study of the warriors has transformed our understanding of these ancient figures. Photography has been essential to studying the warriors from the beginning, allowing researchers to document and analyze faces in detail without physically handling fragile terracotta. Early photographs captured the warriors as they were discovered, providing baseline documentation. As photographic technology has advanced, so has its application to the warriors. High-resolution digital photography now allows researchers to capture details invisible to the naked eye, including subtle tool marks, tiny traces of pigment, and minute variations in clay texture. Three-dimensional scanning technology has revolutionized the study of the warriors' faces and bodies. Laser scanners and photogrammetry systems can create precise digital models of each warrior, capturing their exact dimensions and surface characteristics. These digital models allow researchers to analyze the warriors in ways that would be impossible or damaging with physical examination. The models can be manipulated on computers, viewed from any angle, measured precisely, and compared mathematically with other warriors to detect patterns and variations. Facial recognition software, originally developed for security and identification purposes, has been adapted to analyze the terracotta faces. These programs can measure hundreds of specific points on each face, including the distances between eyes, the width of the nose, the proportions of the mouth, and many other features. By comparing these measurements across multiple warriors, researchers can identify which features vary most and which are more standardized, helping to answer questions about how the warriors were created and whether certain face types appear more frequently than others. These analyses have confirmed that the individuality of the warriors is not an illusion or merely a superficial impression. Statistical analysis of the facial measurements shows that the degree of variation is consistent with what we would see in a real population of humans. While some basic proportions fall within a relatively narrow range, as they do in real human populations, the specific combinations of features create genuine uniqueness for each warrior. Spectroscopic analysis allows researchers to study the chemical composition of the clay, the pigments, and any other materials present on the warriors. This analysis can reveal where the clay was sourced, as different clay deposits have different mineral signatures. It can identify the specific minerals used in pigments and how they were processed. It can detect trace elements that might indicate what tools were used to work the clay or what organic materials were present, possibly including binding agents for the paint or residues from the environment where the warriors stood for centuries. X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy is particularly useful for studying pigments, as it can identify elements present in very small quantities without damaging the warriors. This technique has revealed that some colors that appear similar to the eye were actually created using different mineral pigments, suggesting that the craftsman had access to multiple sources of materials and knowledge of various pigment formulations. Computed tomography scanning, essentially a medical CT scan applied to terracotta warriors, allows researchers to see inside the figures without breaking them apart. These scans reveal how the warriors were constructed, showing the interfaces between different pieces of clay, internal structures, and even voids or cracks that aren't visible from outside. The scans can detect repairs that were made in ancient times, places where craftsmen added clay to fix cracks or imperfections before firing. DNA analysis has been attempted on some warriors, looking for traces of biological material that might have been left by the craftsmen who made them. Human DNA can potentially be recovered from fingerprints or skin cells left on the clay surface before firing. While contamination from modern handling makes this challenging, successful DNA extraction could theoretically provide information about the workers themselves, including their genetic origins and relationships to modern populations. Microscopic examination of surface details reveals tool marks that tell us about the implements and techniques used to shape the warriors. Different types of tools leave characteristic marks, and by studying these marks, researchers can reconstruct what the ancient toolbox might have looked like. Some marks suggest the use of knives or sharp tools for cutting and defining edges. Others indicate scraping tools used to smooth surfaces. Still others show the use of stamps or punches to create textures, particularly for hair and armor details. Experimental archaeology complements these analytical techniques. Modern craftsmen have attempted to recreate terracotta warriors using ancient techniques and materials, helping researchers understand the process and challenges the original craftsmen faced. These experiments have shown, for example, that creating a warrior-sized figure in clay requires specific clay formulations to avoid cracking during drying and firing. They've demonstrated that the modular construction technique was probably necessary for practical reasons, as attempting to sculpt such large figures from single blocks of clay would have been extremely difficult. These recreation experiments have also highlighted the skill required to achieve the level of detail and individuality visible in the original warriors. Even experienced modern sculptors, working with the constraints of ancient techniques and materials, find it challenging to match the quality of the originals. This underscores the expertise of the Qin craftsmen and suggests that they may have spent years developing their skills before being assigned to work on the emperor's tomb. Chemical analysis of the clay has revealed that it came from local sources near the tomb site, which makes logistical sense given the enormous quantity required. However, the clay was carefully processed and refined, with impurities removed and possibly additives included to improve its working properties and firing characteristics. This processing required knowledge and effort, indicating that quality control was important even for the basic materials. The study of firing techniques has revealed that the warriors were fired at temperatures around 1000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to fully harden the clay but not so hot as to risk deformation or melting. Achieving consistent temperatures across such large kilns would have been challenging and required skilled kill operators. Evidence suggests that some warriors were fired more successfully than others, with variation in hardness and durability that reflects the challenges of controlling ancient kill technology. Modern conservation techniques have benefited from scientific analysis. Understanding the chemistry of the clay and pigments allows conservators to develop treatments that stabilize the warriors without causing damage. For example, consolidants that prevent clay from crumbling can be chosen based on how they chemically interact with the specific minerals in the terracotta. Treatments to preserve remaining pigments can be designed to address the specific degradation processes affecting each type of mineral pigment. Environmental monitoring systems track conditions in the excavation pits and storage areas where warriors are kept. Temperature, humidity, air quality, and other factors are continuously measured and controlled to prevent damage. When problems are detected, such as salt crystallization or mold growth, interventions can be made before significant deterioration occurs. Digital archives now preserve detailed records of every excavated warrior, including photographs from multiple angles, 3D scans, chemical analysis results, and conservation treatment history. These archives ensure that even if physical deterioration occurs, detailed information about each warrior's current and past condition is preserved for future researchers. The digital models also allow worldwide access to the warriors for scholars who cannot travel to China, democratizing research and encouraging international collaboration. Virtual reality technology is being used to recreate the pits as they might have appeared when originally sealed, with painted warriors in full formation. These VR experiences allow people to virtually walk among the warriors, examining them up close and getting a sense of what the original site must have been like. While not a substitute for seeing the actual warriors, these virtual recreations provide perspectives that are impossible even for site visitors, such as viewing the formations from above or seeing individual warriors isolated from the crowds of their fellows. Machine learning algorithms are being trained to recognize patterns in the warriors' faces and features. These AI systems might eventually be able to group warriors by the craftsman who made them, identifying artistic signatures that distinguish one sculptor's work from another's. They might also help reconstruct damaged or incomplete warriors by finding similar examples that can serve as templates for restoration. The application of forensic anthropology techniques to the terracotta faces has provided estimates of the ages represented. Anthropologists who normally work with skeletal remains or living subjects to estimate age can apply similar principles to the sculpted faces, looking at the degree of wrinkling, the prominence of bone structure, and other markers that correlate with age. Their analyses confirm that the warriors represent individuals ranging from late teens to perhaps 60s, with most appearing to be in their 20s through 40s, consistent with the age distribution of a real military force. Some researchers have attempted psychological analysis of the faces, looking at expressions and features to make inferences about personality or emotional state. While highly speculative, these analyses sometimes yield interesting observations about how different warriors might have been perceived by ancient viewers, which faces seem authoritative versus which seem more approachable, which appear confident versus uncertain. Whether these perceptions match any intentional characterization by the original craftsman is unknown, but the exercise demonstrates how much information human faces convey even when rendered in clay. The ongoing application of new technologies continues to reveal previously unknown details about the warriors. As scientific instruments become more sensitive and new analytical methods are developed, researchers find new questions to ask and new ways to extract information from these ancient figures. The terracotta warriors, even after decades of intensive study, continue to surprise and inform, their faces yielding secrets gradually to patient investigation. As we move toward the end of our journey through the faces of the Terracotta Army, we must consider what these faces mean, what they tell us about the past and what they continue to teach us in the present. We must reflect on their legacy, their preservation, and their ongoing significance for our understanding of human history and culture. The Terracotta Army stands as one of humanity's greatest artistic and archaeological treasures. The sheer ambition of the project, the scale of its execution, and the level of craftsmanship displayed all mark it as an exceptional achievement. But beyond these impressive qualities, the Army holds particular significance because of the individuality we have been exploring throughout this journey. In a world where most ancient art featured standardized or idealized forms, where individuals were subordinated to types or patterns, the Terracotta Army chose a different path, celebrating human diversity and uniqueness even within a context of military uniformity and collective purpose. This choice to individualize the warriors tells us something profound about the culture that created them. It suggests a society that valued human diversity, that saw worth in representing people as individuals rather than as interchangeable units. Even within the rigid hierarchies and harsh disciplines of the Qin dynasty, even in the context of an authoritarian empire ruled by an autocratic emperor, there was apparently room for acknowledging and celebrating human uniqueness. Each soldier, the faces seem to say, matters as an individual, not just as a component of the collective. This message resonates across time. In our contemporary world, we still struggle with the balance between individual identity and collective belonging, between celebrating our unique characteristics and finding common ground with others. The Terracotta Warriors, with their individual faces arranged in organized formations, embody this tension and perhaps suggest a resolution, that we can be both unique and united, both individually distinct and collectively organized, without these being contradictions. The faces also speak to universal human desires for recognition and remembrance. One of the deepest human needs is to be seen, to be acknowledged as existing, to be remembered after death. The Terracotta Warriors, if they do represent real soldiers or at least embody the reality of real soldiers, serve as monuments to otherwise forgotten individuals. Most ancient soldiers left no trace in historical records. They were born, served, died, and were forgotten, their names and faces lost to time. But these terracotta figures, intentionally or not, preserve the faces of soldiers, or at least soldier types, for eternity. They say to the future, these people existed, they had individual faces and identities, they mattered. This function of the warriors as memory devices extends beyond the specific individuals they might or might not represent. They preserve memory of what Qin soldiers looked like, how they dressed and wore their hair, what diversity existed within the military. They preserve technical knowledge about ancient craftsmanship and artistic capabilities. They preserve cultural information about beliefs regarding death and the afterlife. In their faces and forms, centuries of knowledge and tradition are captured and transmitted to the future. The discovery of the Terracotta Army in 1974 transformed global understanding of ancient Chinese civilization. Prior to this discovery, many Western scholars and general audiences had limited knowledge of China's ancient achievements. The warriors demonstrated the sophistication of Chinese art, engineering, and organization in ways that were undeniable and spectacular. The individual faces, in particular, challenged stereotypes about ancient civilizations and artistic traditions, showing that realistic, individual portraiture was being practiced in China at a time when it was rare in most other cultures. The international exhibitions of terracotta warriors have introduced millions of people around the world to ancient Chinese culture. When warriors travel to museums in Europe, the Americas, Australia, and elsewhere, they serve as ambassadors for Chinese civilization, creating connections and fostering understanding across cultural boundaries. The faces, so obviously human and relatable despite being more than 2,000 years old and from a very different culture, help bridge the gaps between ancient and modern, Eastern and Western, creating moments of recognition and connection. Conservation of the warriors remains an ongoing challenge and responsibility. The terracotta is durable but not indestructible. Environmental factors, microbiological attack, salt crystallization, and physical damage all threaten the warriors. Many were damaged in ancient times, possibly during the rebellions that followed the first emperor's death, and have been painstakingly reconstructed by archaeologists. Others deteriorated during their long burial or were damaged during excavation. Conservation teams work continuously to stabilize and protect the warriors, but with thousands of figures and limited resources, this is a massive undertaking that will continue for generations. The decision about how much of the tomb complex to excavate remains contentious. The main burial mound has never been opened, and many additional pits likely remain undiscovered or unexcavated. There are arguments for proceeding cautiously with excavation, as exposure inevitably leads to deterioration, and preservation techniques continue to improve, meaning that waiting might allow future archaeologists to preserve what current methods would damage. There are also arguments for more aggressive excavation, as new discoveries continue to transform our understanding, and every delay means questions remain unanswered. The faces themselves face particular conservation challenges. The fine details that make them so remarkable, the subtle modeling of features, the delicate paint traces, are precisely what is most vulnerable to deterioration. A broken arm can be reattached, but a face worn smooth by erosion cannot be recovered. Conservation efforts therefore focus heavily on protecting facial features, using consolidants to prevent surface deterioration, controlling environments to minimize chemical degradation, and minimizing handling that could cause mechanical damage. Tourism creates both opportunities and challenges for the warriors. The site attracts millions of visitors annually, providing revenue that supports conservation and research while also creating exposure risks from increased humidity, carbon dioxide, and potential physical damage. Balancing public access with preservation needs requires careful management. Some areas remain closed to the public while others are accessible, creating compromise between education and protection. The cultural significance of the Terracotta Army for China itself is profound. The warriors are a source of national pride, symbols of China's long history and cultural achievements. They appear in promotional materials, tourist campaigns, and cultural diplomacy. They remind Chinese people of their heritage and communicate to the world that Chinese civilization has ancient roots and has produced achievements comparable to any civilization on Earth. The faces of the warriors have inspired artists, writers, and filmmakers. They appear in novels and poems, in paintings and photographs, in documentaries and fictional films. They have been referenced, imitated, and reinterpreted countless times. Each interpretation adds new layers of meaning to the original figures, keeping them alive in cultural consciousness and ensuring that new generations continue to engage with these ancient faces. In educational contexts, the warriors serve as powerful teaching tools. History students learn about ancient China, about the Qin dynasty, about military organization and burial practices. Art students study the sculptural techniques and aesthetic principles. Conservation students analyze preservation challenges. The warriors support learning across multiple disciplines, their richness as historical artifacts making them valuable resources for understanding the past from multiple perspectives. The ethical questions surrounding the warriors are worth considering. They were created through forced labor, part of a massive project that consumed resources and lives under an authoritarian regime. Should we celebrate them despite their problematic origins? This question applies to many ancient monuments built through coerced labor, from the pyramids to numerous palaces and temples. The general consensus is that we can acknowledge the historical injustices involved while still appreciating the artistic and cultural value of what was created, recognizing that the craftsmen and laborers, despite working under compulsion, still achieved something remarkable. The warriors also raise questions about cultural heritage and ownership. They are Chinese national treasures, legally protected and controlled by the Chinese government. Yet they are also world heritage, part of humanity's common legacy, important to people everywhere who care about history and art. Balancing national sovereignty over artifacts with international interest in them is an ongoing challenge in cultural heritage management. International cooperation in research and conservation helps bridge these sometimes competing interests. As we look to the future, the faces of the Terracotta Army will continue to gaze out across the centuries. They will see new technologies applied to their study, revealing secrets we cannot yet imagine. They will be seen by countless visitors, each finding their own meaning and connection in the individual features. They will continue to teach us about the past and about ourselves, about human ambition and creativity, about the desire to be remembered and the power of art to transcend time. The lesson of the faces might ultimately be simple but profound, that humanity is characterized by diversity within unity, that we are each unique yet also fundamentally similar, that individual identity and collective organization are not opposites but can coexist and complement each other. The terracotta warriors, standing in their thousands, each face different yet all part of a single army, embody this duality in clay. They show us that acknowledging individual uniqueness does not prevent collective purpose, that celebrating diversity does not undermine unity. These ancient faces, crafted by hands that turned to dust more than 2 millennia ago, continue to perform their function of guarding and representing. They guard not just an emperor's tomb but also cultural memory and human heritage. They represent not just ancient soldiers but humanity itself in all our diverse individuality. They stand testament to the capabilities of ancient craftsmen, to the ambitions of ancient rulers, to the lives of ancient soldiers, and to the enduring human need to create, to remember, and to be remembered. As this journey ends, as we prepare to drift into sleep, we can hold in our minds the image of these faces, each one different, each one telling its silent story across the gulf of time. We can reflect on how, despite all that separates us from the people who created these warriors and the people they might represent, we recognize something familiar in those terracotta features. We see human faces, expressions we understand, emotions we share, a common humanity that makes these ancient figures somehow still present, still alive in memory and imagination. If you found meaning in this journey through the faces of the Terracotta Army, if these ancient warriors have sparked your curiosity or given you something to ponder as you drift toward sleep, consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, or leaving a comment about your thoughts and reactions. Your support helps these stories reach others who might find comfort or interest in gentle explorations of history's mysteries. But for now, let yourself rest. Let the images of those diverse faces fade into the background of your thoughts. Feel your breathing slow and deepen. Notice the weight of your body sinking into comfort. The terracotta warriors will continue their silent vigil beneath the earth of China, patient and eternal, waiting in their thousands with their individual faces turned toward a future they cannot see but somehow help preserve. And you, having visited them in thought, can carry their silent dignity into your dreams, finding perhaps in their patient stance a measure of peace and perspective on your own brief time in this long human story. Sleep well, knowing that humanity has always created, has always strived, has always sought to leave something of value behind. The faces of the Terracotta Army, sculpted in clay and fired in ancient kilns, stand as witnesses to this enduring truth. They were made to last, and they have lasted, and they will continue to last, faces from the past looking toward the future, bridges between the centuries, reminders of what we have been and what we might yet become. Good night.